Nobody is actually in favor of freedom of speech. If you think you are, you're lying to yourself. Nobody wants complete freedom of speech. There's a bit of a paradox to demonstrate this. Let's say that a growing Nazi movement is gaining ground. The only way to stop it is to suppress the party, suppress their speech, for merely doing nothing but organizing and saying stuff. Now, if you do this, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. But if you don't do this, let's assume that they gain a hold of the political system, a hold of the social system, and themselves suppress freedom of speech. So if you don't act, then you're not in favor of freedom of speech, because freedom of speech will be destroyed. But if you do act, you're not in favor of freedom of speech either, because freedom of speech will also be destroyed. Now, something like this was proposed by Karl Popper, the paradox of tolerance. If you are fully and totally tolerant, then you're tolerant of intolerance. But intolerance will not be tolerant of you. So, to be truly tolerant, you have to be intolerant. Otherwise, you're not in favor of tolerance to begin with. Should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? The answer is no. It's a paradox, but unlimited tolerance can lead to the extinction of tolerance. When we extend tolerance to those who are openly intolerant, the tolerant ones end up being destroyed, and tolerance with them. So tolerance requires intolerance. And this is clear by how societies are set up. Societies have a common binding feature, a common ideals, which they base themselves on. Now, since these ideals are proposing something, there is going to be a set of ideals which negate that. This is the dialectic. Society has a thesis, it proposes something, and then there is something against that, the antithesis. Now, one principle which is common in all societies is preservation. Whether it's socialist, capitalist, monarchist, they are all in favor of preserving their system. Yet this idea of preservation necessarily conflicts with the opposite ideals. Everything has contradictions, and some of the contradictions are non-antagonistic. For example, the bipartisan political system in America contains non-antagonistic contradictions between each other. They still agree with a common set of principles. They're not fundamentally antagonistic with each other. But there are other ideas which are antagonistically contradictory. That is, it advocates violence against its system. How do you handle an antagonistic contradiction? For example, within liberal democracy, fascism might be the antagonistic contradiction. Radical monarchism, revolutionary socialism, those are all antagonistic contradictions to liberal democracy. So, liberal democracy must wish to preserve itself, therefore it must handle these antagonistic contradictions. And the only way to handle them is through violence, through suppression of speech. Otherwise, the antagonistic contradiction will overtake the society and change it, which will create yet more contradictions, non-antagonistic and antagonistic, which it must deal with. Speech is a tool. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. Proper speech can cause people to turn off their rational mind. Like you look at speakers such as Hitler. He was a good speaker. He was able to influence the German population. Their charisma can cause people to turn off their actual rational mind, as the neuroscientist Steven Novella says. This means speech is a tool. It can be used to manipulate. So something that's antagonistically contradictory, such as a Nazi party, can, if properly used, can use speech to radically influence people, to destroy whatever society it exists under. So whether you want to actively suppress freedom of speech or passively want to affect freedom of speech by doing nothing and let those who do suppress freedom of speech into power, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. You can't be. And no society really has been. Like, okay, you have America. Just a couple of years after they ratified the First Amendment, they suppressed freedom of speech, the Alien and Sedition Acts, because an antagonistic contradiction came up and they wanted to preserve their society. During the Civil War, reporters and journalists with a pro-Southern tilt or linked to Southern movements were imprisoned for doing nothing but speaking and writing. Communists, when the Soviet Union was around, were rounded up and arrested for doing nothing except having a different idea. Because America is interested in preserving its ideals. And if it's interested in preserving its ideals, it is not interested in freedom of speech. So freedom of speech it's a rhetorical talking point. So people like, Milo Yiannopoulos and Richard Spencer, if they were in power, if they influenced and spoke to a degree where they had significant influence, do you really think they would be interested in freedom of speech for everyone? For people that they dislike, for the left, for even the moderate left that disagree with their ideals, would they really respect them? Would they really not suppress them?
Are we even pro-free speech?
No, of course not. But we have to use this platform in order.
So we're being radically honest here.
Yes, radically pragmatic. Yes.
History has always shown otherwise. Sure, freedom of speech exists in pockets as an illusion. When speech doesn't have an influence, when it's not affecting anything, it's free. But once it starts to change things, once you take the whole into account, once you take society overall into account and the principles it's based on, there's no such thing as freedom of speech. Not at all.